I was standing in my driveway drinking my morning coffee when I heard the rumble of heavy machinery coming down Maple Street, and that's when I knew my Tuesday was about to go completely sideways. The sound grew louder, echoing off the houses in our quiet neighborhood in Prescott, Arizona. I lived on the edge of what used to be a regular subdivision before it got absorbed into the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association about 3 years back. My property was grandfathered in, meaning I had certain rights that the newer residents didn't, including my private well that had been drilled back in 1987 when my father first bought this land. I watched as a massive asphalt truck turned the corner, followed by a steamroller and what looked like a crew of about 6 workers in hard hats and reflective vests. Behind them came a white BMW that I recognized immediately. My stomach dropped. That was Deborah Kensington's car, and Deborah was the HOA president, a woman who had made it her personal mission to bring order and uniformity to our neighborhood, which really meant making everyone's life miserable with her endless rules and regulations. I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing and walked toward the property line. The trucks were stopping right at the edge of my lot where my land met the common area that the HOA controlled. But something felt wrong. They weren't just stopping at the property line. They were setting up equipment that extended onto my property. "Hey!" I called out, waving my arms. "What's going on here?" Deborah emerged from her BMW like a queen stepping out of a carriage, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She was in her early 50s, with that particular expression of perpetual disapproval that seemed to be a requirement for HOA board members. "Good morning, James," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We're finally moving forward with the community parking lot expansion. Isn't it exciting?" "Parking lot expansion?" I repeated, walking closer. "What are you talking about? And why are your trucks on my property?" She pulled out a rolled-up document from under her arm and unfolded it with a dramatic flourish. "According to our survey, this area is part of the common space. We had it professionally assessed." I felt my jaw clench. "Deborah, you know damn well that's not true. My property line extends 15 feet past where you're standing, and more importantly, my wellhead is right there." I pointed to a spot about 20 feet from where the workers were beginning to unload equipment. The wellhead was covered by a small concrete cap with a locked metal access panel, surrounded by a little fence I'd put up years ago. It wasn't much to look at, but it was essential. That well provided all the water for my house, my garden, and had been grandfathered in when the HOA took over the neighborhood management. I had documentation, permits, everything. "I don't see any wellhead," Deborah said, looking at the area with exaggerated confusion. "All I see is an old concrete pad that's an eyesore and needs to be covered up. Besides, the community voted on this project. We need more parking for residents and their guests." "The community doesn't get to vote on my property, Deborah. And I know you see the wellhead because we discussed it at the last 3 board meetings when you first brought up this parking lot idea. I specifically told you it was non-negotiable." One of the workers approached us, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a clipboard. "Madam, we're ready to start grading. Should we begin?" "Yes, please proceed," Deborah said, not taking her eyes off me. "No, don't proceed," I said firmly, stepping in front of the worker. "This is my property, and you don't have permission to be here, let alone pave over my well." Deborah's expression hardened. "James, you're being unreasonable. This project has been approved by the board, and we have all the necessary permits from the county. If you interfere, I'll have no choice but to call the police and have you removed for obstructing a legitimate construction project." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You got county permits to build on my private property? That's impossible unless you lied on the application." "I think you'll find that everything is in order," she said coldly. "Now, please step aside. The workers have a job to do." I pulled out my phone and started dialing my property lawyer, a guy named Rick Martinez, who'd helped me with some boundary disputes in the past. As it rang, I watched in horror as the workers began setting up orange cones and marking lines with spray paint. They were working fast, probably trying to get as much done as possible before I could stop them. Rick's secretary answered and told me he was in court but would call me back within the hour. I left an urgent message and then called the county permit office. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached someone in the planning department. Yes, I'm calling about a construction permit that was supposedly issued for a parking lot at 4782 Maple Street in Prescott, I said, watching as one of the workers started up the steamroller. The woman on the other end typed something into her computer. Let me see here. Yes, we have a permit on file issued 3 weeks ago for parking lot construction at that address. Is there a problem? Yes, there's a huge problem. That permit is for my private property, and I never gave permission for any construction. There was a pause. Sir, according to our records, the permit was applied for by the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, and they submitted a survey showing the land in question is part of the common area. That survey is fraudulent, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I have the original deed and survey from when this property was purchased. This is my land, and there's a wellhead on it that provides water to my home. I see. Well, if there's a dispute about property boundaries, you'll need to file a formal complaint with our office and provide documentation. However, that process can take several weeks to resolve, and in the meantime, the permit remains valid unless a judge issues an injunction. Several weeks. By then my well would be buried under a parking lot. I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing through options. I could physically try to stop them, but Deborah had already threatened to call the police, and technically they had a permit, even if it was based on false information. I could try to get an emergency injunction, but that would require getting in front of a judge immediately, and it was only 8:30 in the morning. I walked back toward the workers, who were now actively grading the area. Excuse me, I said to the foreman, I need you to stop work immediately. You're about to destroy my well. The foreman looked uncomfortable. He glanced over at Deborah, who was standing by her car with her arms crossed, watching the scene with satisfaction. Look, buddy, the foreman said quietly. I understand there's some kind of dispute here, but I've got a valid work order and a permit. If you've got a problem, you need to work it out with whoever hired us. I can't just stop work because you say so. My well is right there, I pointed again. If you pave over it, I won't have any water. Doesn't that concern you? He shifted uncomfortably. I don't see any wellhead, man. Just an old concrete pad. But like I said, this is above my pay grade. Take it up with the lady in the BMW. I realized he was right. The little fence I'd put up around the well wasn't substantial, and the concrete cap was old and weathered. If you didn't know what you were looking for, it might just look like an old foundation or something similar. Deborah had probably told the construction crew it was nothing important. I marched over to Deborah. You need to stop this right now. If they pave over that well, you're going to be liable for all the damages, including the cost of drilling a new well, connecting to city water, everything. That's going to be tens of thousands of dollars. She smiled, a cold, calculated smile. James, you've been a thorn in the side of this association since the day we took over management of this neighborhood. You refused to follow the rules. You parked that eyesore of a truck in your driveway instead of in your garage like you're supposed to, and you fought us every step of the way on neighborhood improvements. Maybe if your well gets accidentally covered, you'll finally be forced to connect to city water like everyone else and stop pretending you're living on some kind of independent ranch. The mask had slipped. This wasn't about parking spaces or property lines. This was personal. Deborah wanted to punish me for not falling in line with her vision of what the neighborhood should be. You're admitting you're doing this on purpose? I said, making sure my phone was recording in my pocket. I'd started the voice recorder app as soon as I'd hung up with the county. Her eyes flickered with something that might have been concern, but then the cold smile returned. I'm not admitting anything. I'm simply saying that if your alleged wellhead happens to be in the construction zone, perhaps you should have been more proactive about protecting it. We gave plenty of notice about this project. You gave notice about a parking lot on HOA property, not about destroying private property and critical infrastructure on my land. She shrugged. Your interpretation differs from ours. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other HOA business to attend to. Have a wonderful day, James. She got back in her BMW and drove off, leaving me standing there with my blood boiling and the sound of heavy machinery rumbling in the background. I watched helplessly as the workers continued their job. The grading equipment was getting closer to the wellhead. I had maybe an hour, maybe less, before they reached it. I called Rick again and told his secretary that I needed to speak with him immediately, that it was an emergency involving destruction of property currently in progress. She must have heard the desperation in my voice because she said she'd get a message to him as soon as he was out of the courtroom. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my truck keys, drove to the county recorder's office, and got certified copies of my property deed and the original survey. Then I went to the permit office and filed a formal complaint, providing all my documentation. The clerk was sympathetic, but confirmed what I already knew. The complaint would take time to process, and the permit would remain active unless I got a court order. By the time I got back home, it was nearly 11 o'clock, and my worst fears were realized. The construction crew had paved over a significant portion of the disputed area, and they were setting up to pour asphalt directly over where my wellhead was located. I parked my truck and ran toward the site. "Stop! You have to stop!" But it was too late. As I watched, the asphalt truck began pouring the hot black material directly over my wellhead. The workers spread it quickly with rakes, and then the steamroller moved in, compacting it down into a smooth, solid surface. My well was gone, buried under what would become the Pine Ridge HOA parking lot. I stood there, shaking with rage and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. But it was. In a matter of hours, Deborah and her HOA had destroyed my water supply and sealed off access to my well, all while hiding behind a fraudulent permit and a fake survey. My phone finally rang. It was Rick. "James, I got your messages. What's going on?" I explained everything while staring at the fresh asphalt that now covered my property. Rick listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he let out a long sigh. "Okay, this is bad, but we can fight this. First, we need to file for an emergency injunction to stop any further construction. Second, we need to file a lawsuit against the HOA for property damage, trespass, and fraud. Third, we should report the fraudulent permit application to the county and possibly the district attorney. This might actually be criminal." "Rick, they already paved over the well. The injunction is too late." "I understand, but we don't want them to continue. And more importantly, we need to start building our case. Can you document everything, take photos, videos, get copies of all your communications with the HOA?" "I've been documenting everything. I even recorded Deborah essentially admitting that she knew about the well and didn't care." "Good. That's very good. Send me everything you have. In the meantime, I'll start drafting the paperwork. But James, I need to be honest with you. This is going to be expensive, and it's going to take time. We're probably looking at months of litigation, possibly years if they appeal." "I don't care. They can't just get away with this." After I hung up with Rick, I spent the rest of the afternoon documenting everything. I took dozens of photos of the new parking lot, showing exactly where my wellhead had been. I measured the distances from my house and my property markers, proving that the construction had extended well onto my land. I printed out copies of all my emails with the HOA, including the ones where I'd specifically warned them about the well location. That evening, I turned on my kitchen faucet and water came out, but I knew it wouldn't last. The well system had some water stored in the pressure tank, but once that was depleted, nothing would be able to refill it because the wellhead was now inaccessible, sealed under 2 inches of asphalt. By the next morning, my water pressure had dropped significantly. By that afternoon, it was barely a trickle. By evening, nothing came out of the taps at all. I was without water. I called the city water department to ask about getting connected to the municipal system. The customer service representative was helpful, but delivered bad news. Because my house was in an area that had well water, the city lines didn't extend to my property. To get connected, I'd need to pay for the infrastructure extension myself, which would cost somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, plus the actual connection fees and the cost of abandoning my well properly. I couldn't afford that. I was a mechanical engineer at a small firm in Prescott, made a decent living, but I didn't have $60,000 lying around for emergency water infrastructure. That night, I had to go to a friend's house to shower and fill up jugs of water for drinking and cooking. It was humiliating and infuriating. I'd lived in this house for 15 years, ever since my father passed away and left it to me. I'd never had a problem with water. And now, because of Deborah's vindictive power trip, I was essentially homeless in my own home. Over the next week, things got worse. Rick filed the emergency injunction, but the judge denied it, saying that since the construction was already complete, there was nothing to enjoin. We filed the lawsuit, but the HOA's lawyer responded with a motion to dismiss, claiming that the HOA had acted in good faith based on a professional survey and that any property dispute should be resolved through the normal channels before damages could be assessed. Meanwhile, I was living like a nomad. I showered at the gym, filled water jugs at friends' houses, and used disposable plates and utensils to minimize water usage for washing dishes. I couldn't do laundry at home. I couldn't water my garden, which was dying in the Arizona heat. My life had been turned upside down. The worst part was seeing that parking lot every day. It sat there, a pristine expanse of fresh black asphalt, mocking me. And people were using it. Residents of the neighborhood parked there like nothing was wrong, completely oblivious to the fact that they were parking on top of my destroyed well. 2 weeks after the paving, I attended the monthly HOA meeting. It was held in the community center, a nice building that the HOA had built with everyone's dues money. About 30 residents were there, along with the 5-member board of directors, with Deborah presiding as president. I waded through the usual boring business, reports on landscaping contracts, discussions about holiday decorations, arguments about someone's fence color. Then, during the open forum section, I stood up. "I'd like to address the board about the new parking lot," I said. Deborah's expression tightened. "Of course, James. Please keep your comments to 3 minutes." I walked to the front of the room and turned to face the other residents. 3 weeks ago, the HOA paved a parking lot that extends onto my private property. In the process, they buried my wellhead under asphalt, cutting off my water supply. I now have no running water in my home. There was a murmur of surprise from the crowd. Several people looked at Deborah, who maintained her composure. "I specifically warned the board about the well location," I continued. "I provided documentation showing that the construction would destroy my water supply. But they proceeded anyway, using a fraudulent survey to obtain permits for construction on my land. I've now been without water for 2 weeks, and the cost to remedy this situation is tens of thousands of dollars that I don't have." "That's quite enough," Deborah interrupted. "Mr. Sullivan, you're making serious accusations without evidence. The board acted in accordance with all applicable laws and regulations. If you have a dispute about property boundaries, that's a civil matter between you and the association, not something to be aired in a public meeting." "I have plenty of evidence," I shot back. "I have the original survey showing my property line. I have emails where I warned you about the well. I even have a recording of you admitting that you didn't care if my well got covered." That got people's attention. Deborah's face flushed red. "I never said any such thing, and any recording you claim to have would be inadmissible, as you didn't inform me I was being recorded. You're clearly a disgruntled homeowner trying to interfere with community improvements. Security, please escort Mr. Sullivan out." 2 guys from the neighborhood watch, basically volunteers who helped with HOA events, stood up hesitantly. They looked uncomfortable with the situation. "Come on, James," one of them said quietly. "Let's not make a scene." I looked around the room at the other residents, hoping someone would speak up, would question what the HOA had done, but most of them avoided eye contact. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want to be the next target of Deborah's wrath. I left the meeting, but not before saying one last thing. "You all better hope the HOA never decides your property is inconvenient, because if they can do this to me, they can do it to any of you." The lawsuit crawled forward at the pace of continental drift. Depositions were scheduled and rescheduled. The HOA's lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to delay and complicate everything. My legal bills were mounting, and Rick had warned me that even if we won, it could take years to collect any judgment, especially if the HOA appealed. Meanwhile, I was still without water. I'd set up a system where I kept 5-gallon jugs that I refilled every few days, but it was exhausting and unsustainable. I'd lost weight because cooking was such a hassle without easy water access. My garden was completely dead. My house was starting to feel less like a home and more like a prison. That's when I started thinking about the water supply for the rest of the neighborhood. I knew that most of the houses in Pine Ridge were connected to the city water system, but I also knew something that most residents didn't know, because I'd been around when the neighborhood was first developed. The original neighborhood, before the HOA took over, had been designed with a shared well system for about a dozen houses on the eastern edge of the development. When the city water lines were extended years later, most of those houses had converted to city water, but the old well system was still active, still functional, and still provided water to exactly 8 houses. Those 8 houses included Deborah Kensington's house. I'd discovered this by accident years ago when there'd been a problem with the old well pump, and several neighbors had asked me for help since I had experience with well systems. I'd gone down into the old pump house, which was on HOA common property, and helped them figure out the issue. The pump house was still there, hidden behind some landscaping near the retention pond at the edge of the neighborhood. For weeks I tried to push the thought out of my mind. 2 wrongs don't make a right. If I retaliated, I'd be just as bad as Deborah. I'd be stooping to her level. But every morning when I woke up and had to brush my teeth with bottled water, every time I had to drive to the gym just to take a shower, every time I saw that parking lot sitting on top of my sealed well, the anger built up a little more. The final straw came about 6 weeks after the paving. I received a letter from the HOA's lawyer. It informed me that because I'd been keeping 5-gallon water jugs on my front porch, and because my garden had died, creating an eyesore, I was in violation of the HOA covenants. I was being fined $500, and if I didn't remedy the violations within 30 days, I'd be fined an additional $500 per month until compliance was achieved. They destroyed my water supply, and now they were fining me for the consequences of their actions. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at that letter, and something inside me snapped. That night, I drove to the old pump house. It was after midnight, and the neighborhood was quiet. I parked a few streets away and walked through the darkness, carrying a backpack with tools. The pump house was a small concrete block building, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with a metal door secured by a padlock. I'd helped install that padlock years ago, and I still had the key. It had been on my keychain for so long I'd forgotten about it, but when I'd gone looking earlier that day, there it was. I unlocked the door and slipped inside, closing it behind me before turning on my flashlight. The pump house was exactly as I remembered it. The well pump sat in the corner, humming quietly, drawing water from deep underground and sending it through a series of pipes that branched out to feed the 8 houses on the old system. I found the main distribution line, the pipe that carried water from the pump to the rest of the neighborhood. It was a 4-inch PVC pipe that ran along the wall before disappearing through a hole in the concrete. I could shut off the pump, but that could be easily fixed. Someone would just come and turn it back on. But if I cut the water line, created a break in the system, that would be much more complicated to repair. They'd have to find the break, dig up the pipe, replace the damaged section. It would take days, maybe longer, especially if they didn't immediately realize where the problem was. I stood there for a long moment, my hand on the pipe, considering what I was about to do. This was criminal mischief at minimum, possibly worse. If I got caught, I could face charges, I could go to jail. But they'd buried my well. They'd destroyed my water supply, left me without basic necessities, and then had the gall to fine me for the consequences. Deborah had used the HOA as her personal weapon to punish me, and the legal system was moving too slowly to provide any real justice. I made my decision. Using a hacksaw, I cut through the PVC pipe. Water immediately began gushing out, spraying across the small room. I'd anticipated this and had worn rain gear, but I was still soaked within seconds. I let the water flow for a minute, ensuring that the break was complete and the pressure in the system had dropped. Then, I turned off the pump to stop the flooding and opened the door to let the water drain out. I didn't damage anything else. I didn't vandalize the equipment or disable the pump. I simply created a break in the water line that would need to be repaired before the system could function again. Then, I locked the door and walked back to my truck, my heart pounding. The next morning, I woke up to furious pounding on my door. I opened it to find Deborah standing there, her hair disheveled, her face red with anger, still wearing a bathrobe. "My water's off!" she practically shouted. "I have no water!" I looked at her, keeping my expression neutral. "That's terrible. Have you tried calling a plumber?" "This isn't just me. There are 8 houses without water. Something's wrong with the old well system." "The old well system? I thought everyone was on city water." "Most people are, but a few houses still use the shared well. You know about it. You helped with it years ago." I remember helping with a pump issue once. Yeah? Have you called a well service company? She glared at me. Don't play dumb, James. This is quite a coincidence, isn't it? The HOA covers your well, and suddenly our water goes out? Are you accusing me of something, Deborah? Because that would be a pretty serious accusation. Do you have any evidence? Her jaw clenched. I know you did this. I don't know how yet, but I know you did. Maybe it's just karma, I said. Maybe now you understand what it's like to live without water? How does it feel? Not so great, right? Imagine living like this for weeks. If I find out you sabotaged the well system, I'll have you arrested. Do you understand me? If you have evidence of a crime, you should definitely call the police, I said calmly. In the meantime, might I suggest buying some bottled water? I hear 5-gallon jugs are really convenient, though they are an eyesore on your porch. You might get fined for that. She made a sound of pure frustration and stormed back to her car. I watched her drive away, then closed my door and poured myself a bowl of cereal with bottled water. Over the next few days, chaos erupted in Pine Ridge. The 8 houses without water were all on the HOA board or were prominent supporters of Deborah's policies. This wasn't a coincidence. When the original neighborhood had been developed, those houses were the first ones built, the premium lots that had gone to the developer's friends and family. Now they were owned by the neighborhood elite, the people who ran the HOA like their personal fiefdom. The HOA immediately called in a well service company, but the first company they called couldn't diagnose the problem. The pump was running fine. The well itself was producing water. But somehow no water was reaching the houses. It took them 3 days to realize that the problem was inside the pump house, that the main distribution line had been cut. By then, all 8 affected families had been forced to make alternative arrangements, buying bottled water, showering at friends' houses, the same things I'd been doing for weeks. When they discovered the cut pipe, Deborah immediately called the sheriff's department and reported vandalism. 2 deputies came out, examined the pump house, and took a report. They dusted for fingerprints and asked if the HOA had any idea who might have done this. Deborah told them I was the prime suspect, that I had a grudge against the HOA and had helped with the well system in the past, so I knew how to access it. The deputies came to my house that afternoon. I invited them in and offered them water from my bottled supply. Mr. Sullivan, we're investigating vandalism at the Pine Ridge pump house, one of the deputies said. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with a serious expression. Do you know anything about that? I heard there was a problem with the well system, I said. Several of my neighbors mentioned they were without water. The HOA president says you have a dispute with the association and that you have access to the pump house. She thinks you might be responsible for damaging the water line. That's interesting. Yes, I have a major dispute with the HOA. They buried my well under a parking lot and cut off my water supply. I've been living without running water for almost 2 months now, but I didn't vandalize their pump house. The deputies exchanged glances. Can you tell us where you were 3 nights ago between midnight and 3 a.m.? I was here sleeping. I live alone, so I don't have an alibi, if that's what you're asking. Do you have a key to the pump house? I might. I helped with some repairs there years ago, and someone might have given me a key. To be honest, I'd have to check my keychain. I have a lot of old keys on there. Would you mind if we took a look at your tools? See if you have anything that could have been used to cut a PVC pipe? I thought about it for a moment. I'd thoroughly cleaned the hacksaw I'd used, washing it with bleach and water to remove any PVC residue. It was sitting in my garage with a dozen other tools, indistinguishable from any other hacksaw. Do you have a warrant? I asked. The deputy who'd been doing most of the talking shook his head. No, we don't. But if you're innocent, it would help clear your name if you cooperated. I understand, but I also understand my rights. The HOA has been harassing me for months, and now they're trying to pin this on me without any evidence. If you want to search my property, get a warrant. They couldn't argue with that. They asked me a few more questions, told me not to leave town, and then departed. I watched them go, knowing that this was far from over. The HOA hired a plumbing company to repair the broken pipe, which took another 2 days. When the water was finally restored, Deborah sent out a neighborhood-wide email announcing that the well system had been maliciously sabotaged and that the HOA was working with law enforcement to identify the perpetrator. She offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to an arrest, but there was no evidence. I'd been careful. I'd worn gloves, I'd cleaned everything, and the pump house didn't have any security cameras. They could suspect me all they wanted, but suspicion wasn't evidence. Rick called me about a week after the incident. "James, I heard about the vandalism at the HOA well. Please tell me you had nothing to do with that." I was silent for a moment. "If I did, would you still represent me?" "James, for God's sake, did you cut their water line?" "Rick, you're my lawyer. If I tell you something in confidence, it's privileged, right?" There was a long pause. "Yes, attorney-client privilege protects our communications. But James, if you committed a crime, I can't help you cover it up. I can defend you if you're charged, but I can't be part of ongoing criminal activity." "I understand. Hypothetically speaking, if someone had cut the HOA's water line in retaliation for the HOA burying that person's well, would that be a problem for our civil lawsuit?" Another pause. "Hypothetically, it could be a big problem. It could make you look vindictive and unstable. It could give the HOA ammunition to paint you as the unreasonable party. It could even result in criminal charges that would complicate everything. Hypothetically, that would be a very stupid thing to do." "Okay, good to know. James, I need you to tell me straight. Did you vandalize the HOA's pump house?" I thought carefully about how to answer. "Rick, I'm living without water because of what the HOA did to me. My life has been destroyed. The legal system is moving at a snail's pace, and in the meantime, I'm suffering every single day. Can you understand why someone in my position might feel desperate enough to take matters into their own hands?" "I understand the feeling, but that doesn't make it legal or smart. James, please tell me you didn't do this." "The sheriff's deputies came to talk to me. They asked for permission to search my property, and I refused. They don't have any evidence. If they did, they would have arrested me already." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I can give you right now." Rick sighed deeply. "All right. If you do get charged with anything, call me immediately. Don't say anything to the police without me present. And James, for both our sakes, don't do anything else stupid." I promised I wouldn't, and we ended the call. Life continued in its strange new rhythm. I kept filling my water jugs, kept showering at the gym, kept living like a refugee in my own home. The HOA completed the parking lot, adding neat white lines and even installing a little sign that said, "Pine Ridge Community Parking Residents Only." Every time I looked at it, I felt a mixture of rage and grim satisfaction. They'd taken my water, but I'd taken theirs, at least temporarily. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Then, about 3 months after the original paving incident, something unexpected happened. I received a call from a reporter named Sarah Chen from the Prescott Daily Courier. She'd heard about my situation and wanted to do a story on it. "I've been investigating HOA abuses in the Prescott area," she explained when we met at a coffee shop downtown. "Your case sounds particularly egregious. Would you be willing to talk to me on the record?" I told her everything. About the warning I'd given the HOA, about the fraudulent survey, about coming home to find my well buried under asphalt. I showed her all my documentation, the photos, the emails, the recordings. I even told her about the vandalism at the HOA pump house, though I didn't admit to being responsible. "This is incredible," Sarah said, taking notes furiously. "And you've been without water for how long now?" "Almost 3 months." 3 months, and the HOA hasn't offered any assistance or compensation? "They've offered to fine me for keeping water jugs on my porch." Her article came out the following week on the front page of the local news section. The headline read, "HOA buries homeowner's well, leaves him without water for months." It was a detailed, well-researched piece that laid out exactly what had happened, including quotes from me, from county officials confirming the questionable permit, and even a brief no comment from Deborah. The reaction was immediate and intense. The article got picked up by the Associated Press and spread to news outlets across Arizona and then nationally. Suddenly, I was getting calls from other reporters, from TV news stations, from HOA reform advocates. A producer from a local news station came out to film a segment at my house, showing my collection of water jugs, the dead garden, and the parking lot sitting on top of my buried well. That segment went viral on social media, with thousands of people expressing outrage at what the HOA had done. The court of public opinion was decidedly on my side, and the Pine Ridge HOA found itself in the middle of a PR nightmare. Deborah stopped responding to media inquiries altogether, and the HOA's lawyer released a terse statement saying that the matter was in litigation and they couldn't comment further. But the publicity had an effect. Within 2 weeks of the article's publication, I received a call from a civil engineering firm in Phoenix. They'd seen the news coverage and wanted to help. They offered to assess my situation pro bono and help me find a solution. 2 engineers came out to my property and spent several hours examining everything. They confirmed what I already knew. The well was completely inaccessible under the parking lot, and removing the asphalt to regain access would essentially destroy the parking lot. They provided me with a detailed report estimating that the total cost to remedy the situation, including either drilling a new well or connecting to city water, would be between $55,000 and $70,000. Rick incorporated this report into our lawsuit, and we filed an amended complaint seeking specific damages. We also filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the facts were not in dispute and that the court should order the HOA to pay for remediation immediately rather than waiting for a trial. The publicity also caught the attention of the Yavapai County District Attorney's Office. An investigator contacted me and asked if I'd be willing to provide information about the fraudulent survey and permit application. I gave them everything I had. About a month later, I learned that the DA was opening a criminal investigation into the HOA's actions, specifically looking at whether board members had knowingly submitted false information to obtain the construction permit. Things were finally moving, but slowly. It was now winter in Prescott, which made living without water slightly less miserable since I wasn't dealing with the summer heat, but it was still a constant struggle. I'd lost more weight. I developed chronic fatigue from the stress and the inconvenience of my living situation. My work was suffering because I was constantly distracted by legal issues and media requests. Then, in February, almost 6 months after my well had been buried, I got the call I'd been waiting for. Rick's voice on the phone was excited. "James, the judge granted our motion for summary judgment. He ruled that the HOA is liable for the damage to your well and ordered them to pay for remediation plus damages for your suffering and inconvenience. The total judgment is $93,000. I felt like I couldn't breathe. $93,000? Yes. $55,000 for drilling a new well and connecting it to your house, $20,000 for the 6 months you've lived without water, and $18,000 for the legal fees we've incurred so far." The judge was not happy with the HOA. He called their actions reckless and unconscionable in his ruling. "When do I get the money?" "That's the tricky part. The HOA has 30 days to appeal, and if they do, it could delay payment for months or even years. But there's something else. The judge also issued an order requiring the HOA to provide you with temporary water access immediately, pending the permanent remediation. They have to pay for bottled water delivery to your house within 7 days, or they'll be in contempt of court." For the first time in months, I felt something like hope. The HOA did appeal, of course, but they also complied with the judge's order and arranged for a water delivery service to bring me 5 5-gallon jugs twice a week. It wasn't the same as having running water, but it was better than what I'd been dealing with. More importantly, the publicity and the legal victory had emboldened other residents who'd been mistreated by the HOA. 3 other homeowners approached me about joining together to file a class action lawsuit over various HOA abuses. We had a resident who'd been fined $10,000 for painting his house a shade of beige that was allegedly not on the approved color list. We had a couple who'd been denied permission to install solar panels despite state law protecting their right to do so. We had a widow who was being threatened with foreclosure over unpaid fines related to her late husband's truck, which she couldn't move because she didn't have the keys. Together, we hired a law firm that specialized in HOA litigation, and they were salivating at the chance to take on Pine Ridge. The pattern of abuse was clear, and with my case as the centerpiece, We had a strong argument that the HOA board had been operating with a consistent disregard for homeowners' rights. In March, the DA's office finally filed charges. Deborah Kensington and 2 other board members were charged with fraud and making false statements on a government document. The charges were related to the fake survey they'd submitted to obtain the construction permit. The news hit the neighborhood like a bomb. There was an emergency HOA meeting where angry residents demanded the board's resignation. Deborah tried to maintain control, insisting that the charges were politically motivated and that she'd done nothing wrong, but the membership wasn't buying it. A vote was called, and Deborah and the other 2 board members who'd been charged were removed from the board by an overwhelming majority. A new interim board was elected, and their first act was to settle my lawsuit. They agreed to pay the full judgment amount without further appeal, and they also agreed to drill my new well immediately. Within 2 weeks, I had a well drilling company at my property, and within 4 weeks, I had running water again. The first time I turned on the tap and water flowed out freely, I actually teared up. It had been 8 months. 8 months of living like I was camping in my own house, of showering at the gym, of washing dishes in a plastic tub with bottled water. 8 months of constant stress and struggle. But it was finally over. I had water. I had money to cover my expenses and compensate me for my suffering. And the people responsible were facing criminal charges. The criminal case against Deborah and the other board members moved forward slowly. Their lawyers tried to get the charges dismissed, arguing that the fake survey had been a good faith mistake. But the DA had evidence that Deborah had specifically instructed the surveyor to redraw the property lines to include my land. She'd known exactly what she was doing. In August, almost a year after my well had been buried, the case finally went to trial. I attended every day, sitting in the courtroom and watching as the prosecution methodically laid out the case against Deborah and her co-conspirators. The surveyor testified that Deborah had told him to adjust the property boundaries and had promised him extra payment under the table. The construction foreman testified that Deborah had instructed him to proceed even after I'd warned him about the well. The county permit office confirmed that the survey submitted with the permit application didn't match the official property records. My testimony was the most satisfying. I got to sit on the witness stand and tell the whole story from the beginning, with Deborah sitting at the defense table glaring at me. I told the jury about her admissions that she knew about the well. I played the recording where she essentially said, I deserved to have my well covered. I described the 8 months I'd spent without water. The defense tried to paint me as a disgruntled homeowner with an axe to grind, someone who'd refused to cooperate with reasonable neighborhood improvements. They brought up the vandalism at the pump house, suggesting that I was vindictive and untrustworthy. But the prosecution countered effectively. Even if I was difficult, even if I had vandalized the pump house, which was never proven, that didn't give the HOA the right to destroy my property and forge documents to do it. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for all 3 defendants. Deborah's face went white when the verdict was read. Her lawyer immediately moved for a mistrial, which was denied. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In October, I sat in the same courtroom and watched as the judge sentenced Deborah Kensington to 18 months in prison, 3 years of probation, and restitution of $93,000, which essentially meant she personally had to reimburse the HOA for the judgment they'd paid me. The other 2 board members got lighter sentences, 6 months in prison and probation. Deborah's perfect life, her position of power in the neighborhood, her sense of control over everything and everyone around her, it all came crashing down because she decided to abuse her authority to punish someone who wouldn't fall in line. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into the bright Arizona sunshine. Sarah Chen, the reporter who'd first broken the story, was waiting with a camera crew. "James, how do you feel about the outcome?" she asked, holding a microphone toward me. I thought about it for a moment. I feel like justice was served, but it took way too long and cost way too much. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone. HOAs need stronger oversight and homeowners need better protections. But at least in this case, the people responsible are being held accountable. Do you have any regrets about how you handled the situation? I knew she was fishing for a confession about the pump house, but I wasn't going to give her one. I wish I'd fought harder earlier. I wish I'd gone to the media sooner. I wish I hadn't given the HOA the benefit of the doubt for so long. But no, I don't regret standing up for my property rights. The story had a happy ending, more or less. My new well worked perfectly, providing clean, abundant water. The settlement money covered all my expenses, and then some. The HOA had new leadership that was actually responsive to homeowners' concerns, and Deborah Kensington was going to spend a year and a half in prison thinking about what she'd done. But there was one more piece of business to take care of. About a month after the sentencing, the new HOA board president, a reasonable guy named Tom who'd lived in the neighborhood for years, called me. "James, I wanted to talk to you about the parking lot," he said. "The board has been discussing it, and we think the right thing to do is to remove the portion that's on your property and restore the land to its original condition." "I appreciate that, Tom, but actually, I have a different idea." "Oh?" "The parking lot is useful. People do need those spaces, and honestly, I don't need that land. What I need is for the HOA to formally acknowledge that they screwed up, to make a permanent record of what happened so it can never happen again." "What did you have in mind?" "Draw up a proper easement agreement giving the HOA the right to maintain the parking lot on that portion of my property. But include in the agreement a full description of what happened, how the parking lot was originally built without permission, how it destroyed my well, and how the responsible parties were held accountable. File that agreement with the county so it becomes part of the permanent property records, and in exchange, the HOA pays me $5,000 a year for the easement rights." Tom was quiet for a moment. "You want us to pay you rent for land we already paved?" "I want documentation that what happened here was wrong, so the next time an HOA decides to abuse their power, someone can point to this case and say, 'Remember what happened in Prescott?' And yes, I want the HOA to compensate me for the use of my land. It's only fair." Tom agreed. The new board drew up the easement agreement exactly as I'd specified, with a detailed recitation of the facts and an acknowledgement that the original construction was done without permission and resulted in criminal convictions for the board members involved. They agreed to pay me $5,000 annually for as long as the parking lot remained. The agreement was recorded with the Yavapai County Recorder's Office, and suddenly, my property had one of the most unusual easements in the county records, one that read like a cautionary tale about HOA overreach. I framed a copy of the easement agreement and hung it in my living room, right next to a photo of the new well being drilled. They serve as reminders of what I went through, what I fought against, and what I ultimately won. Life in Pine Ridge is different now. The new HOA board is careful, maybe even timid, about enforcement. They've learned that homeowners have rights and that those rights can't be trampled just because a board president doesn't like someone. They've implemented new procedures requiring independent verification of property boundaries before any construction projects, and they've established an ombudsman system for residents who feel they're being treated unfairly. As for me, I still live in my house with my new well providing all the water I need. My garden is thriving again. I've paid off all my legal bills with the settlement money and even have some left over for a rainy day. And every time I turn on the faucet and water flows out, I appreciate it in a way I never did before. People sometimes ask me if I vandalized the HOA pump house. I never confirm or deny it. The statute of limitations for criminal mischief in Arizona is 1 year, so even if I had done it, which I'm not admitting, I can't be prosecuted for it now. What I will say is this: when people are pushed too far, when they're left without basic necessities, when the legal system moves too slowly to provide relief, they sometimes take matters into their own hands. Whether that's right or wrong, I'll leave for others to judge. But I will say that the 8 houses on that old well system, including Deborah's house, now pay a premium assessment to the HOA for maintenance of their water infrastructure. They have to keep that old well system functional, because switching to city water would cost each of them tens of thousands of dollars. And every time they write that check, I hope they think about what it was like to be without water, even if only for a few days. Karma has a funny way of working things out. The parking lot remains, a black scar across what used to be my property, but now it's there legally, properly documented, and I'm compensated for it. The wellhead that's buried under it will stay there forever. A time capsule of sorts, a monument to one woman's vindictive abuse of power and the consequences that eventually caught up with her. Sometimes I drive past the prison where Deborah is serving her sentence, and I wonder if she understands yet what she did wrong, if she's capable of that kind of self-reflection. Probably not. People like her rarely think they're the villain in the story. They always find a way to justify their actions, to blame others for the consequences. But it doesn't matter what she thinks anymore. What matters is that she can't hurt anyone else from behind bars, and when she gets out, she'll be a convicted felon with a permanent record, unable to serve on an HOA board or wield that kind of power again. The story made waves far beyond Prescott. I've been contacted by homeowners from across the country dealing with similar HOA nightmares. I've done interviews for podcasts about property rights, for YouTube channels about HOA horror stories, for advocacy groups pushing for HOA reform legislation. Some states have passed new laws inspired partly by what happened to me, laws that require HOAs to carry insurance for property damage claims, laws that create expedited court procedures for emergency situations, like someone being cut off from essential utilities, laws that make it a crime for HOA board members to knowingly submit false information to government agencies. I never wanted to be a poster child for HOA reform, but I've accepted the role. If my suffering can prevent someone else from going through what I went through, then maybe it was worth it. These days, when I'm not working at my engineering job, I volunteer with a local organization that helps homeowners fight back against abusive HOAs. I review documents, I share my experience, I connect people with lawyers who specialize in this kind of work. It's become something of a second career. And every spring, when I plant my garden and water it with water from my own well, water that I don't have to pay a city utility for, water that flows freely and abundantly, I remember why I fought so hard. Property rights matter, independence matters, the ability to live peacefully on your own land without someone else's arbitrary rules and regulations dictating every detail of your life matters. I'll never forget what Deborah and the Pine Ridge HOA took from me. Those 8 months of struggle and hardship, but I also won't forget that I fought back, that I won, and that the system, however slowly and imperfectly, eventually worked. The parking lot sits outside my window as I write this, cars coming and going, people completely unaware of the battle that was fought over this piece of ground. But I know, I remember, and the county records will remember long after I'm gone. A permanent testament to what happened here, a warning to future HOA boards who might be tempted to abuse their power. Justice delayed is justice denied, they say. But sometimes, if you fight hard enough and long enough, justice does come, even if it takes a year and leaves you exhausted and broke in the process. And sometimes, the sweet taste of victory is worth every bitter moment that led to it. I still live in Pine Ridge, still wake up every morning in the house my father left me, still look out at the Arizona landscape that I love. The HOA sends me my annual easement payment like clockwork. My new well has never had a single problem, and life goes on, quieter now, calmer, but forever changed by what I endured and overcame. The lawyers tell me that my case is now taught in law schools as an example of HOA liability and criminal exposure for board members who abuse their authority. The engineering firm that helped me pro bono has taken on similar cases in other states using the playbook we developed. And Sarah Chen won a regional journalism award for her coverage of the story. Something good came from something terrible, which I suppose is the best you can hope for when you find yourself in an impossible situation. I didn't set out to be a crusader or a symbol. I just wanted to protect my home, my water, my basic rights. But sometimes that's how movements start, with one person standing up and saying, "This is wrong, and I won't accept it." So if you're reading this and you're dealing with an abusive HOA, know that you're not alone. Know that you can fight back. Know that the system, for all its flaws, can work if you're persistent and you have good documentation and you don't give up. And know that sometimes, when they bury your well under their parking lot, the appropriate response is to make sure they understand what it feels like to be without water, one way or another. I never did get that $500 fine removed from my account. The HOA claimed it was issued before the new board took over, and they couldn't reverse it. But I didn't pay it either, and they haven't tried to collect it. I think they understand that I'm not someone who's going to roll over anymore, that if they push me, I'll push back harder. The garden is producing tomatoes again, fat and red and delicious, watered by my own well. I grilled some last night with chicken, sitting on my back porch, watching the sunset over the Arizona hills. Life is good again. Not perfect, but good. And somewhere, in a cell in the Arizona Department of Corrections, Deborah Kensington is learning that actions have consequences, that you can't just destroy people's lives without eventually paying a price. I sleep well at night, better than I have in years. The sound of water running through pipes is a lullaby, a reminder that I won, that I survived, that I'm home.